The courtroom was silent, the air thick with finality as the judge raised his gavel. Lillian Carter stood motionless, her hands cold against the steel of her handcuffs, her breath shallow as she braced for the words that would seal her fate. This court sentences. Before the judge could finish, a voice rang out, cutting through the silence like a blade. Wait. I have proof. All heads turned as a 12-year-old girl stood up, gripping a phone with shaking hands. Lillian's heart stopped. Her daughter, Sophie, had just interrupted a life sentence. And from the look on her face, she was about to change everything. The courtroom was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. The air felt heavy, charged with tension, as everyone waited for the judge to speak. Lillian Carter stood in the center of the room, her hands bound in cold steel handcuffs, her body stiff as she stared straight ahead. She tried to ignore the stares from the jury, the murmurs from the audience, and the look of quiet satisfaction on the prosecutor's face. She had been through weeks of this trial, listening to one accusation after another, each one painting her as a cold-blooded criminal. They said she had poisoned a customer's coffee, that she had laced it with a toxic substance and watched as he collapsed onto the diner floor. They said she had every reason to do it, that she had argued with Jonathan Reeds just days before, that she had been overheard complaining about him to a coworker, and that her fingerprints were found on the very cup that nearly ended his life. The evidence was stacked against her. The prosecution had played security footage that showed her serving him the coffee, and they made sure the jury knew that no one else had touched it after she had placed it on his table. The toxicology report confirmed that poison had been present in the drink. The only witness, another waiter from the diner, testified that she had been acting strangely that evening, that she had seemed nervous and distracted. It was all too perfect, too damning, and yet Lillian knew one thing for certain: she was innocent. She had said it over and over, through every questioning, every cross-examination, every tearful plea to her defense attorney. She had done nothing wrong. But no one believed her. The only thing she had left was hope, and even that was running out. Judge Robert Miller, a stern man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority, sighed as he flipped through the documents before him. The courtroom waited, tense and silent, as he prepared to speak. This court has carefully reviewed the evidence presented, along with witness testimony, and after due deliberation, the jury has reached a verdict. Based on the facts of this case and the undeniable proof provided. He lifted his gavel. Lillian felt her breath catch in her throat. This court sentences. A voice suddenly cut through the silence. Wait. I have proof. Gasps rippled through the room as all eyes turned toward the back of the courtroom. Lillian's heart stopped when she saw her daughter, Sophie, standing on her feet, gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes were wide and desperate, filled with tears, but there was no hesitation in her voice. Judge Miller frowned, his patience clearly running thin. "Young lady, court proceedings cannot be interrupted." Sophie shook her head quickly. "You can't send my mom to prison. You have to see this first." Lillian's defense attorney immediately rose, his eyes sharp with sudden interest. "Your Honor, if there is new evidence, we have an obligation to review it." The prosecutor looked irritated, but he didn't object. The courtroom had already erupted into whispers, and ignoring a desperate plea from a child in front of a full audience would not look good for him. Judge Miller hesitated, glancing between Sophie, Lillian, and the attorneys before letting out a slow exhale. "Approach the bench," he finally said. With shaking hands, Sophie hurried forward and handed her phone to the court assistant. Within seconds, the screen lit up, and the entire courtroom turned their attention to the evidence she was about to reveal. Lillian had no idea what was about to happen, but as she watched the determined look on her daughter's face, a spark of something she hadn't felt in weeks flickered in her chest. Hope. The courtroom remained silent except for the faint rustling of papers and the clicking of the court clerk's keyboard as the video loaded onto the large screen at the front of the room. Lillian stood frozen, her pulse hammering against her ribs as she watched her daughter's trembling hands release the phone into the court assistant's grasp. Sophie's face was pale, her lips pressed together as she wiped at her damp cheeks with the sleeve of her hoodie. She had always been a quiet child, never one to draw attention to herself, but now she was standing in the center of a packed courtroom, holding her mother's fate in her hands. Judge Miller adjusted his glasses as he leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter, you claim to have evidence that could alter this case. Where did you obtain this video?" Sophie swallowed hard, her voice small but steady. "It's from the security cameras outside the diner." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Lillian's attorney straightened in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Your Honor, the prosecution provided security footage, but it was only from the interior of the restaurant. If there is additional footage that was not included in discovery, this could be critical." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. That footage was deemed irrelevant. It did not capture the alleged poisoning, only exterior movement outside the premises. Judge Miller narrowed his eyes. "Then it shouldn't contradict the evidence already presented. Let's see it." The screen flickered, and the video began to play. The quality was grainy but clear enough to make out the scene. The timestamp on the footage showed the exact date and time of the incident. The camera, mounted on a pole outside the diner's back entrance, faced the employee entrance and part of the alleyway behind the building. At first, there was nothing unusual. The kitchen staff occasionally walked in and out, taking smoke breaks or throwing away trash. Then, at exactly the time when Lillian was accused of poisoning the coffee, a familiar figure stepped into frame. Lillian's breath caught. It wasn't her. On the screen, Tom Wilson, one of the other waiters, emerged from the back entrance, looking around as if to check if anyone was watching. He held something small in his hand. He moved quickly, stepping up to the counter near the back door, where orders for takeout were often placed temporarily before being taken to customers. And then, clear as day, he poured something into a coffee cup. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Lillian felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the edge of the defendant's table to steady herself. Judge Miller raised a hand to silence the murmurs. His sharp gaze turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Davis, would you care to explain why this footage was not included in the trial?" The prosecutor, looking visibly rattled for the first time during the entire case, flipped through his notes as if he could somehow find an explanation hidden between the pages. "Your Honor, the footage was deemed unnecessary because it did not capture the main dining area where the poisoning allegedly took place." The judge's voice turned ice cold. "It captures someone other than the defendant tampering with a beverage. How exactly was that deemed unnecessary?" The color drained from the prosecutor's face. Judge Miller cut him off with a raised hand. "We'll address this later. For now, play the rest of the video." Lillian tore her gaze away from the prosecutor and focused back on the screen. In the footage, Tom hurriedly placed the cup back down before stepping away and disappearing back inside. Less than a minute later, Lillian walked into frame, completely unaware of what had just happened. She picked up the order, the very same cup and took it inside to deliver it to Jonathan Reed's. It was undeniable proof. Lillian hadn't poisoned anyone. She had been set up. Her mouth went dry, and she turned to look at her daughter, who was staring at the screen with wide, fearful eyes. Lillian could barely breathe. Sophie had done what no one else had. She had found the truth when even her own defense team had failed her. Judge Miller removed his glasses and exhaled sharply. "This changes everything." The courtroom erupted into noise. The prosecution scrambled to recover, but the weight of the video was too much. The evidence they had built their entire case on had just collapsed in front of them. Lillian felt the first sting of tears in her eyes as she looked back at Sophie. Her daughter had saved her life. The courtroom had descended into chaos. The judge's gavel struck the bench several times, demanding order, but the murmurs and shocked exclamations refused to die down so quickly. Lillian sat frozen in place, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. For weeks, she had lived under the crushing certainty that no one believed her, that no one cared enough to look deeper, but now, everything had changed in an instant. Judge Miller turned toward the prosecutor, his expression unreadable but his voice heavy with authority. "Mr. Davis, you will explain to this court why this piece of crucial evidence was not presented during the trial." The prosecutor, clearly shaken, adjusted his tie as he cleared his throat. "Your Honor, as I stated before, this footage was deemed irrelevant to the case as it did not show the alleged poisoning taking place inside the restaurant. The prosecution did not deliberately withhold anything, we simply did not find this footage significant at the time." Lillian's defense attorney, who had been silent in stunned disbelief, finally found his voice. "Not significant? This video shows a completely different person tampering with a drink, one that was later consumed by the victim. It directly contradicts the prosecution's entire case against my client." Judge Miller's face darkened. "I agree. The fact that this was overlooked, or worse, ignored, is a serious concern. For now, I want to hear from the detective in charge of this investigation." A uniformed officer, who had been sitting near the prosecution's table, hesitated before standing. He adjusted his badge and approached the bench, clearly nervous under the weight of what was unfolding. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Detective, when reviewing the security footage, were you aware that this particular clip existed?" The detective's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Your Honor, we reviewed all available footage, but we prioritized what was inside the diner because that was where the incident occurred. We may have overlooked this specific angle." Lillian felt her stomach twist. It was hard to tell whether it was incompetence or deliberate negligence, but either way, it had nearly cost her everything. Her attorney wasn't finished. "Your Honor, this raises serious concerns about how this investigation was conducted. My client has been sitting in jail for weeks, awaiting a life sentence for a crime she didn't commit, while the real perpetrator was working alongside her, walking free." Judge Miller nodded grimly before looking toward the prosecution. "Mr. Davis, does the state wish to continue pressing charges against the defendant in light of this new evidence?" The prosecutor hesitated. He glanced at the video still displayed on the screen, the image of Tom Wilson hovering over the coffee cup like a damning mark of guilt. He glanced toward his notes as if searching for a way to argue against what had just been shown, but there was no argument left to be made. "Your Honor," Davis finally said, his voice stiff, "given the evidence presented, the prosecution is willing to re-evaluate its case. At this time, we are requesting a recess to review the footage further." Judge Miller nodded but didn't look pleased. "Very well. Court is adjourned for 1 hour." As soon as the gavel struck, the tension in the room broke. People began speaking in hushed voices, reporters in the back scrambling to send updates on what had just unfolded. Lillian barely heard any of it. She turned toward Sophie, who still stood near the defense table, gripping her hoodie sleeves nervously. Lillian's body felt weak with relief, but she forced herself to stand, moving toward her daughter. The moment Sophie looked up, her face a mix of fear and hope, Lillian pulled her into a tight embrace. "You saved me," Lillian whispered, her voice breaking as she held her daughter close. "I don't even know how to thank you." Sophie's small fingers clutched the back of her mother's prison-issued uniform as she shook her head. "I just wanted them to see the truth. I knew you didn't do it, Mom. I had to find a way to prove it." Lillian pulled back just enough to cup Sophie's face in her hands, searching her daughter's tear-filled eyes. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Before either of them could say anything else, a commotion erupted on the other side of the courtroom. Tom Wilson had just been detained. Lillian turned her head just in time to see two officers leading him away, his face pale and tight with panic. He wasn't handcuffed yet, but it was clear he knew that things were unraveling fast. As he was escorted past the defense table, his gaze met Lillian's for a brief moment. She had spent weeks wondering who had done this to her, who had decided to destroy her life, and now, she was looking him in the eye. Tom opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, maybe even defend himself, but the officers kept him moving. Lillian exhaled shakily. The nightmare wasn't over yet, but for the first time since this all began, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. A way out. The hour-long recess felt like an eternity. Lillian sat at the defense table, her hands clenched together as she tried to steady her breathing. Around her, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations, reporters whispering to one another, the sound of papers shuffling and footsteps echoing across the polished floor. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but she refused to look at them. Her focus remained on Sophie, who sat beside her, small and exhausted but holding on to her mother's hand with a quiet determination that Lillian didn't deserve but was endlessly grateful for. Her attorney had been on the phone since the recess began, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, likely trying to push for an immediate motion to dismiss. Lillian didn't dare to hope too much yet. The prosecution was rattled, but that didn't mean they would simply let her walk free without a fight. She had seen it happen before, cases where the truth didn't matter as much as the need to maintain a conviction. When the bailiff called for everyone to rise, Judge Miller entered the courtroom again, his expression unreadable. He took his seat, adjusting his glasses before looking directly at the prosecution. "Mr. Davis, the court has now had time to review the new evidence. Do you wish to proceed with the charges against the defendant, or is the state prepared to reconsider its position?" Lillian held her breath as the prosecutor stood, clearing his throat before addressing the court. "Your Honor, in light of the security footage that was presented, the prosecution acknowledges that there is now reasonable doubt regarding Ms. Carter's involvement in this crime. However, we believe further investigation is needed before making any final decisions regarding charges against the newly identified suspect, Mr. Wilson." Lillian's attorney immediately stood, his voice sharp. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my client has spent weeks behind bars for a crime she did not commit. This video does not just create reasonable doubt, it completely exonerates her. There is no basis to keep her in custody for even a second longer." Judge Miller turned back to the prosecution. "Mr. Davis, is the state formally dropping all charges against Ms. Carter?" The prosecutor hesitated for just a second too long. Lillian's stomach twisted at the silence. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, Davis let out a slow breath. "The state moves to dismiss all charges against Lillian Carter." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom, murmurs of relief rippling among the spectators. Lillian felt her legs weaken, her head light, as if the world had tilted beneath her. She had dreamed of hearing those words, had begged for someone, anyone, to believe her. And now, it was over. Judge Miller nodded, his voice firm. "The charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed. Ms. Carter, you are free to go." The words didn't feel real. The cuffs around her wrists were removed, and as soon as she felt her arms loosen, the reality of it crashed over her like a tidal wave. She turned to Sophie, who was already crying, and pulled her into the tightest hug she had ever given in her life. "I told you," Sophie whispered against her shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. "I told you I'd prove it." "You did," Lillian whispered back. "You saved me." She barely registered what was happening around her. Her attorney shook her hand firmly, whispering about possible civil suits and legal action against the state for wrongful imprisonment. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones being pushed in her face, voices overlapping with questions. "How do you feel right now? Will you sue the city? What will you do next?" None of it mattered. The only thing she cared about was holding her daughter. As the courtroom emptied, Lillian looked up and saw the officers leading Tom Wilson away in handcuffs. This time, there was no hesitation. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and when his gaze met hers, she saw something in them she hadn't expected: guilt. She didn't know if it was because he regretted what he had done or if he was just afraid of what would happen to him now. Either way, she didn't care. He had nearly stolen her life, had nearly taken her away from Sophie forever, and now he would have to answer for it. Lillian took Sophie's hand and walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, feeling fresh air without the weight of chains or prison walls around her. She was free. But she knew one thing: this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Lillian had expected to feel an overwhelming sense of relief the moment she walked out of the courthouse, but instead, a strange numbness settled over her. The past few weeks had been a nightmare, each day stretching endlessly, each hour filled with fear that she might never see her daughter again. Now she was free, yet the weight of what had happened refused to leave her shoulders. She tightened her grip on Sophie's hand as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the bright sunlight making her squint after so many days spent under the dull fluorescent lights of the jail. Reporters swarmed them immediately, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in her face, voices overlapping as they shouted questions. "Lillian, how does it feel to be a free woman? Will you be pressing charges against the state? Do you have a message for the man who framed you? Do you blame the justice system for failing you?" The noise was suffocating. Sophie tensed beside her, shrinking against her mother as strangers crowded too close. Lillian didn't care about the reporters or their questions. All she wanted was to get Sophie away from this madness. She wrapped an arm around her daughter protectively and pushed forward, ignoring the voices calling her name. A familiar car pulled up to the curb, and her attorney, Michael, stepped out, waving them over. "Come on, let's get you out of here." Lillian barely waited for the door to open before she ushered Sophie inside. The second the door shut, blocking out the noise of the press, she let out a shaky breath. Michael slid into the driver's seat and glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "How are you holding up?" Lillian ran a hand over her face, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. "I don't even know." Sophie rested her head against her mother's shoulder, still clutching the phone that had saved Lillian's life. Michael pulled away from the curb, maneuvering through traffic before speaking again. "You know, the media is going to be all over this for a while. A wrongful conviction, an innocent single mother almost sentenced to life, a child proving the system wrong, it's the kind of story they don't let go of easily." Lillian sighed. "I don't want any part of it. I just want to go home." Michael nodded. "I understand that, but you need to think about what comes next. You have a strong case for a lawsuit against the state. They failed you, and you deserve compensation for what they put you through." Lillian stared out the window, watching the city blur past. She hadn't even had time to process her freedom, let alone think about lawsuits or the legal battle that might follow. But deep down, she knew Michael was right. The justice system had nearly ruined her life. If it weren't for Sophie finding that footage, she would be spending the rest of her days in a prison cell for a crime she didn't commit. She glanced down at her daughter, brushing a hand over Sophie's hair. "Right now, I just want to be with her. That's all that matters." Sophie lifted her head slightly. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Lillian forced a smile, even though she wasn't sure of the answer. "We will be. I promise." When they finally pulled up to their apartment building, Lillian hesitated before stepping out. It felt surreal to be home again. She had memorized every detail of this place, clinging to the image of it in her mind while she sat in her jail cell, wondering if she would ever walk through that door again. Inside, everything was exactly how she had left it: Sophie's schoolbooks still on the dining table, an unfinished grocery list pinned to the fridge, the laundry basket half full in the hallway. It was as if time had frozen while she was gone. Sophie walked in ahead of her, looking around uncertainly before turning back to her mother. "It feels weird, doesn't it?" Lillian nodded. "Yeah. It does." She dropped her bag onto the couch and sat down heavily, running a hand through her hair. Sophie hesitated before sitting beside her, glancing at her with a hesitant look. "Are you okay?" Lillian let out a slow breath. "I don't know. I think it's going to take a while before this feels real." Sophie shifted uncomfortably, her fingers still clutching her phone. "I was so scared, Mom." Lillian turned to her, pulling her close. "Me too, baby. But you were so brave." Sophie sniffled, rubbing her eyes. "I just kept thinking, what if no one listened? What if they didn't believe me?" Lillian felt her throat tighten. "You never gave up on me. You did what no one else did. You found the truth." Sophie curled into her mother's side, letting out a shaky breath. "I just wanted you to come home." Lillian held her tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm here now. And I'm never leaving you again." For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. But she knew deep down that this wasn't over. There were still questions that needed answers, justice that needed to be served, and a future that needed to be rebuilt. For now, though, she would let herself breathe. Because she was home. Lillian had always thought that coming home after a long shift at the diner was the best feeling in the world. Kicking off her shoes, sinking into the couch, and listening to Sophie talk about her day used to be her idea of peace. But now that she was actually home after weeks of wrongful imprisonment, everything felt different. The walls of her apartment, once warm and familiar, now felt strange, like she was stepping into someone else's life. She spent the first night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts refusing to settle. Sophie had curled up beside her, too afraid to sleep in her own bed, as if she still needed to make sure her mother was really there. Lillian had held her close, running her fingers through her daughter's hair, whispering soft reassurances. But deep down, she wasn't sure which one of them needed comforting more. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a knock at the door. For a brief second, panic seized her chest, a leftover instinct from the nightmare she had just escaped. She forced herself to take a breath before getting up and opening the door. Michael stood there, holding a stack of papers and a cup of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing her the cup. Lillian took it gratefully, inhaling the rich scent. "You figured right. Come in." Michael stepped inside, glancing around the apartment. "How are you holding up?" She let out a dry laugh as she took a sip of coffee. "I have no idea. I feel like I just walked out of a bad dream, but everything's still blurry." Michael nodded as he set the stack of papers on the table. "That's normal. What happened to you isn't something you just bounce back from overnight." Lillian sat down, rubbing her temples. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if Sophie hadn't found that video. If no one had listened to her." Michael sighed, taking a seat across from her. "The system failed you, Lillian. There's no other way to put it. If it weren't for your daughter, you'd be spending the rest of your life in prison for something you didn't do." Lillian swallowed hard. "What happens now?" Michael leaned forward. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. You have a case against the state. They rushed your conviction, ignored evidence, and nearly destroyed your life. You can sue for wrongful imprisonment, emotional distress, and lost wages, among other things." Lillian exhaled. "I don't know if I have the energy for a lawsuit. I just got my life back. I don't want to spend the next few years fighting another battle." Michael studied her carefully. "I understand that. But this isn't just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. If we hold them accountable, maybe next time, they'll actually do their job right." Lillian glanced toward the hallway where Sophie was still sleeping. Her daughter had been the one to save her, but what if it had been another mother, another child, someone without the resources to find the truth? She took a deep breath and met Michael's gaze. Okay. What do we do? Michael pulled a few papers from the stack. First, we file a formal complaint against the prosecution and the detective in charge of your case. We demand a full internal review of how the evidence was handled. Then, we begin the lawsuit against the state for wrongful imprisonment. It's going to take time, and they're going to fight back, but we have a strong case. Lillian nodded slowly. I don't want money. I just want them to admit they were wrong. Michael smiled slightly. That's the hardest thing to get from the system. But we'll try. Just as he was about to continue, Sophie walked into the room, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She looked between them, her gaze settling on the stack of papers. Are you talking about the case? Lillian reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Yeah, sweetheart. We're going to make sure this never happens again. Sophie hesitated before sitting beside her mother. Can I help? Michael raised an eyebrow. You already did more than any of us. Without you, none of this would have been possible. Sophie looked down, fidgeting with her fingers. I just don't want anyone else to go through what we did. Lillian felt a lump rise in her throat. She pulled Sophie into a hug, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Me neither. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to hope. The fight wasn't over, but at least this time, she wasn't facing it alone. Lillian had always thought that once she was free, everything would fall back into place. She imagined walking back into her old life like nothing had happened, picking up where she left off, and moving forward without looking back. But reality was far more complicated. Her first few days outside of jail were filled with exhaustion. Every morning, she woke up in a panic, her body still adjusting to the absence of a cold cell and the constant hum of prison noise. At night, she tossed and turned, replaying every moment of the trial in her head, wondering how close she had come to losing everything. Sophie refused to leave her side, always watching her as if afraid she might disappear again. They were both carrying the weight of what had happened, even if neither of them wanted to say it out loud. The lawsuit against the state had been officially filed, but it would be months, possibly years, before they saw any real progress. Michael had warned her that the government would try to delay, deny responsibility, and minimize what had been done to her. The fight would be long and difficult, but she was determined to see it through. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of unpaid bills that had stacked up while she was in jail, her phone rang. She hesitated before answering, her voice tired. Hello? A familiar voice came through the line. Lillian, it's Dana. Her former boss. Lillian sat up straighter. Dana, hi. I didn't expect to hear from you. There was a pause on the other end. I just wanted to check on you. I heard what happened, and I can't believe it. We all knew something wasn't right, but seeing you actually go through that? It was terrifying. Lillian swallowed hard. It was worse than I ever imagined. But Sophie found the truth, and now I'm trying to figure out what's next. Dana hesitated again. That's actually why I called. Look, I don't know if you'd even want this, but if you need your job back, it's yours. No questions asked. Lillian was caught off guard. The diner had been a place of routine, familiarity, and stability for years. But now, just the thought of stepping back inside made her stomach twist. The idea of taking orders, carrying trays, and smiling at customers as if nothing had happened felt impossible. Dana, she said carefully, I appreciate it, but I don't think I can come back. Not after everything. Dana sighed. I figured. But if you ever change your mind, the door is open. After they hung up, Lillian sat in silence for a long time. She had spent years working at that diner, believing it was where she belonged. But after everything she had been through, she wasn't the same person anymore. She couldn't go back to who she was before, and maybe she didn't want to. Sophie walked into the kitchen, holding her tablet. "Mom, you have to see this." Lillian turned to her, eyebrows raised. "What is it?" Sophie placed the tablet on the table and played a news clip. A reporter stood outside the courthouse, speaking to the camera. The wrongful imprisonment of Lillian Carter has sparked outrage across the city, with many questioning how such a critical piece of evidence was overlooked. A petition demanding reforms in the way evidence is handled in criminal cases has already gathered over 50,000 signatures in less than a week. Lillian blinked in shock. "People actually care about this?" Sophie nodded. "Everyone online is talking about it. Some lawyer even wrote an article about how this kind of thing happens more often than people think. They're saying your case could actually change things." Lillian felt a strange mix of emotions. For weeks, she had felt powerless, like she was just another person caught in a system too big to fight. But now, people were paying attention. They were listening. Sophie hesitated before speaking again. "Mom, what if you did something with this? I mean, you always said you wanted to help people. Maybe this is how you do it." Lillian frowned. "Help people how?" Sophie shrugged. "I don't know. Talk about what happened. Make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." The idea unsettled her. The last thing she wanted was to relive every awful moment of her trial, to be the face of some movement when she still didn't feel whole herself. But at the same time, if telling her story could stop another innocent person from going through what she did, didn't she owe it to them? She looked at her daughter, realizing that Sophie had already made up her mind. She had seen firsthand what happened when the system failed. She had fought against it and won. And now, she wanted her mother to fight too. Lillian exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I can do this." Sophie reached for her hand. "You don't have to do it alone." And for the first time, Lillian let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough to keep fighting. Lillian never thought she would be standing in front of a room full of people, telling her story. The thought of reliving everything she had been through was terrifying, but as she stood at the podium, looking at the faces of those gathered before her, she realized something important: this wasn't just about her anymore. The community center was packed, filled with journalists, activists, law students, and people who had followed her case from the moment Sophie's video had gone public. Some were strangers who had simply been moved by the injustice of it all, others were people who had experienced similar failures of the justice system firsthand. Lillian wasn't a public speaker, she wasn't a lawyer, and she had never imagined herself being the voice of anything. But here she was, standing under the bright lights, holding a microphone with slightly shaky hands. Michael stood off to the side, giving her an encouraging nod. Sophie sat in the front row, her eyes locked on her mother, filled with the same unwavering belief that had saved Lillian's life. That belief was what gave her the strength to begin. She took a deep breath and spoke. "My name is Lillian Carter, and until a few weeks ago, I was just a waitress, a single mother trying to make ends meet. I never thought I would see the inside of a courtroom unless I was serving coffee to a lawyer on their lunch break. But then, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. I was accused of poisoning a man, and I spent weeks behind bars, facing a life sentence, all because the system decided that I was guilty before they even had all the facts." A few people murmured, nodding in agreement. Lillian tightened her grip on the microphone. "They told me the evidence was undeniable. They showed the jury security footage of me serving the coffee. They had a witness say I was nervous that night. They found my fingerprints on the cup, as if that proved I had done something to it. What they didn't have was the truth. What they didn't do was their job." She saw people leaning in, listening, absorbing every word. Some had seen her face on the news, some had read about her case in articles, but this was the first time she was speaking for herself. "If it weren't for my daughter, I wouldn't be standing here today," Lillian continued, her voice growing steadier. She found the one piece of evidence no one else had bothered to look for. She found the truth that should have been found long before I ever stepped into a courtroom. If a 12-year-old girl could uncover the truth, then why couldn't the people in charge of delivering justice do the same? Applause broke out, not loud, but strong enough that Lillian had to pause. She glanced down at Sophie, who gave her a small, proud smile. "I know I'm not the only person this has happened to," Lillian said after a moment. "I was lucky. I had someone who fought for me. But how many people don't? How many people are sitting in a cell right now, knowing they're innocent, but with no one to prove it? How many families have lost their loved ones because the system failed them?" The silence that followed was heavy. Lillian felt the weight of it, the unspoken truth that everyone in the room knew. This wasn't just her story. This was the story of countless others who had never gotten their moment of justice. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "I don't know if I can change the system. But I do know that I won't be silent about what happened to me. I won't pretend this was just a mistake that I should move on from. Because if we let this go unanswered, it will happen again. And again. And again." More applause. Some people stood. Others wiped at their eyes. Lillian felt her heart pounding, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. As she stepped down from the podium, Michael met her with a firm handshake. "That," he said with a smile, "was the beginning of something big." Sophie ran up to her, wrapping her arms around her waist. "You did amazing, Mom." Lillian hugged her daughter tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they left the community center, the cool evening air hit her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free in a way that had nothing to do with a prison cell. She had survived. She had fought back. And now, she was ready to help others do the same. This story is not just about wrongful imprisonment or the failures of the justice system, it's about resilience, the power of truth, and the unwavering bond between a mother and her daughter. Lillian Carter's journey is one of survival, but more importantly, it is one of transformation. She starts as an ordinary woman, a single mother just trying to get by, only to be thrown into a nightmare where the world decides she is guilty before she even has a chance to defend herself. The system, designed to seek justice, nearly destroys her, not because she was a criminal, but because it was too easy to assume she was. The most powerful element of this story is Sophie's role as the catalyst for justice. She represents the persistence and clarity that adults, lost in bureaucracy and power struggles, often overlook. A child, armed with nothing but a phone and the truth, does what an entire legal system failed to do: prove innocence. Sophie is the heart of this story, a reminder that courage doesn't come from power, but from the refusal to let injustice win. The ending is satisfying not just because Lillian is freed, but because she refuses to let her experience be forgotten. Many stories of wrongful convictions end with the victim simply walking away, grateful to be free but too exhausted to fight further. But Lillian chooses a different path. She turns her pain into purpose, stepping into a role she never imagined for herself, a voice for those still trapped in the same nightmare she escaped. This is a story about ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances. It's about the flaws in the system, but also about the hope that remains when people refuse to be silent. Lillian and Sophie's story is not just one of survival, but of victory, not only over injustice, but over the fear that the truth might never be heard. It is a reminder that sometimes, one voice, no matter how small, can change everything.